right, hello everyone. Welcome to the Alexander Hamilton Society's event on, well, Japan, China, and I guess the United States. We're joined today by Dr. Zach Cooper. Zach Cooper is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies U.S. strategy in Asia, U.S. alliances and partnerships, and Chinese economic statecraft and coercion. Before joining AEI, Dr. Cooper was a senior fellow for Asian security at the Center for Strategic and International Study from 2013 to 2018. And Dr. Cooper's also served as co-director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy, a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and research fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. He's also served in government as assistant to the Deputy National Security Advisor for combating terrorism, and as a special assistant to the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, long titles as always with the government, at the Department of Defense. Dr. Cooper received his Bachelor of Arts in Public Policy from Stanford University and has earned a Master's in Security Studies, an MPA in International Relations, and a PhD in Security Studies from Princeton University. Dr. Cooper has since returned to Princeton, where he now also teaches as a lecturer in Public and International Affairs. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cooper.
Well, it's just great to be here. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thanks to the whole AHS team for finding a good time for me to come up. And I know it's midterm season and the like, so I appreciate folks coming out. So what I want to talk about today is the US, China, and Japan. And I'm sure you all spend a fair amount of time reading about China and China's rise, and I'm certainly happy to talk about that. But I think one issue that we don't pay nearly enough attention to is what's happened with Japan over the last roughly decade. And in my view, this has been one of the most fundamental transformations that we've seen of any major country in terms of its security stance in decades. And it's something that I think people tend to overlook. So I want to talk a little bit about why that I think is the case and what some of the implications are, and then I'm really looking forward to the discussion with all of you. So the place I want to start is that if you go back just not too far in history, but go back to the 1990s or the late 1980s, you would have found a whole bunch of literature that would have characterized Japan as the main threat to the United States, right? So the most famous line about this was that the Cold War was over and Japan had won. That was a saying right in the early 90s after the Soviet Union fell. And the story at the time was that Japan was looking pretty strong economically. It had in some areas shown that it could really surpass the US in terms of production of things like vehicles, a lot of advanced microprocessors and other things. And so the worry was that Japan was sort of jumping ahead of the US. And we went through a period, therefore, in the 1990s that was incredibly rocky in terms of US-Japan relations. People talked about maybe the US-Japan security lines just breaking and maybe Japan would go its own way. There were people in the United States who suggested that we should do away with the alliance because it wasn't helpful to the United States to be protecting Japan, which seemed like it could be our big competitor. So this is where we were in, let's say, the mid-1990s. A increasingly adversarial relationship with a country which we fought 50 years prior and which we still have 50,000 troops in. And now, let's call it 30 years later, we are basically in a fundamentally different world, where actually the US-Japan alliance, I think, is probably the most important alliance for the United States today, and becoming even more important. So I want to just walk through how I think that happened, why I think it's important, and what it means going forward. And as I said, I think the place to start is in the 1990s, and the challenge that Japan faced at the time was how to grow economically without having to spend more money on its military. And the short answer was to rely more on the United States. And that's what Japan indeed had done since really the 1950s. That had been the explicit Japanese plan under something called the Yoshida Doctrine, which was basically that Japan would build up its economy after the war, and that the US, which was an occupying power at the time, was going to pay for Japan's security. In fact, the US was going to put its forces into Japan and keep them there for decades and decades, as we know. And that deal has frankly been the deal that sort of informed the US-Japan alliance until maybe the last couple of years. Some might say it really started to break apart in December. So what happened in December is that the new Japanese government announced that it is going to increase defense spending for basically the first time in 60, 70 years in a substantial way. There had been a ceiling of about 1% of gross domestic product spent on defense that Japan had basically since shortly after World War II. That ceiling is now in the process of being broken. I'll say a little bit more about this. We're not there yet, but we're getting there. And the Japanese government has explicitly said that their aim in 5 years is to spend 2% of gross domestic product on defense. Going from 1.07% to 2% might not seem like that big a deal, but this would make Japan the third largest military spender in the world. For a country that until recently we talked about as being a little too selfish, some people would say, not spending enough on its military, or still stuck in this pacifist mindset that it was sort of delivered into after World War II. And now what we're seeing is that potentially 5 years from now, Japan could be, again, the world's third largest military spender. And not just that, pretty clearly the most capable and important US military ally. So I want to walk through that, as well as 3 other issues, because my core argument for tonight is that I think Japan is the most important ally basically for 4 reasons. The first is security, which I just mentioned, and I'll get into more. The second is economics. The third is technology cooperation. And the fourth is what I'll call sort of global governance, but we might call values issues here. And I'm going to argue that Japan is the only country in the world that basically has the same interests and the same desires as the United States in all of those 4 areas, and is actually capable of contributing in all 4. Which is not to say that there aren't other countries that are important, but it is to say that most of them actually aren't critical in each of these areas. So I'll just give you one example, the United Kingdom, which I love and spend a lot of time with British diplomats, but at the end of the day, Great Britain is not a technology powerhouse, right? Certainly not in the way that Japan is. Another good example, right, would be a country like Australia, which is really important to the United States. And I spend a lot of my time on Australia. It's just not that big economically. It doesn't have the heft that Japan has, right, as the world's 3rd largest economy. And so we have a lot of really close allies around the world, but none of them is like Japan. Japan is the only one, in my view, that basically has the same the same interests and the same capability to deliver in each of these areas: security, economics, technology, and values issues. So I just want to walk through each of those areas for a couple minutes each and make the case for why I think Japan is so critical, and then come back to this question about where's Japan going next. And I think the place to start, as I said, is on the security area. And why start on security? Because this is the one where Japan has always sort of under-delivered, right? And again, we have to go back in history to remind ourselves why. We had a pretty big hand in writing the Japanese Constitution after the end of the Second World War, right? We were an occupying power. Some in Japan will tell you that the US is still an occupying power. I was just dealing with the provincial government in Okinawa, which will insist that this is still the case. But at the end of the day, you know, the US and Japan had some really big security challenges early after World War II. Russia in particular was posing a threat to Japan, and so Japan had to build back some of its military capabilities, which are called the self-defense forces now. But Japan never really took on the burden of being able to do a serious warfight against a major adversary. They always were reliant on the United States to do that. And what we've basically seen from this Japanese government is that they have shifted almost overnight to a posture, in my view, that is basically preparing to get ready for the possibility of a really large conflict with China. It's not to say they're doing everything that some of us would like, but just to give you a sampling of the things that they've done in just the last, let's say, year or two. So I already mentioned the increase in defense spending, which is very significant and is going to allow a lot of other things to happen. But that's not the only thing. So in the last few months, Japan has agreed that it's going to fund what are called counter-strike capabilities. So think of things like cruise missiles, which Japan basically, until now, has not had. So it used to be said that Japan was the shield and the United States was the sword in the US-Japan alliance. In other words, Japan protected its territory and US forces on its territory, and then the US did all of the striking power, right? US aircraft carriers, US fighters and bombers, they were gonna be doing the bulk of the fighting from this protected shell that Japan would give us. And now what we're seeing actually is a complete reversal of that. We're seeing Japan invest in the exact capabilities that they've always relied on us to bring to bear. So that's a really big change. A third change is we're seeing Japan finally move away from what used to be a pretty big focus on its army, what it calls the ground self-defense force. And that army was focused mostly on preventing an invasion of Russia, by Russia, into the Kuril Islands, right? Also known as the Northern Territories in Japan. And that's not highly likely in the near future. But Japan has kept that large army for several decades, even though the threat has decreased. And now what we're seeing is Japan spending lots of money and lots of energy on its Navy and its Air Force. And a lot of this sort of goes without people paying too much attention, interestingly. And I think part of the reason is that there is still this mindset that Japan is sort of stuck in the past, right? Or is, as some people would say, is too pacifistic. But I think what we've seen from the new Japanese government and following on the Abe administration in particular is that actually Japan is really changing. And I think there are a couple things that woke Japan up in the last year that have triggered what I think is basically the beginning of a revolution in Japan's approach. Others will disagree with me on this, and I'm happy to have a debate about it in the discussion. But the two things that I think have had the biggest effect, number one was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I work a lot with Japanese businesses and a fair amount with the Japanese government. And I can tell you that a year ago, until the invasion actually happened, Japanese officials, Japanese business leaders thought it was crazy and that there was no chance that Russia would invade Ukraine. And they had a good reason, I think, to be skeptical, because it's turned out to be a pretty terrible decision by Vladimir Putin. But they just didn't believe it was going to happen. And some of this is because they had people in Moscow and Kyiv telling them that there wasn't going to be an invasion. But some of this was that I think many in Japan just didn't feel that a major conflict was possible anymore in the world, right? The story that they sort of told themselves was, look, we had World War II, that was terrible, people have learned their lesson, we're not gonna get into a major conflict of that sort, right? And now we've got the outbreak of a huge conflict in the middle of Europe, right? Something that was, I think for a lot of people, quite unthinkable. And it has forced many in Tokyo to ask the question of, well, if this can happen in Ukraine, why can't it happen on, say, Taiwan, right? And so that happened in February. And then, as many of you probably remember, 6 months later in August, Nancy Pelosi decided to go to Taiwan, which we can also talk about if folks want. That had a huge effect, I think, on many in Japan, right? Because the first effect from Russia was to say, well, look, it is actually still possible that you can get a major conflict in the world today, even one including great powers. And then Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan created so much concern that China was going to do something serious. And China did do something serious from Japan's point of view, which was that it launched missiles into Japan's claimed exclusive economic zone. And so, in fact, what we saw from Tokyo shortly after Nancy Pelosi's visit was a real fear that what had happened in Ukraine could happen, maybe not this year, but sometime soon in Taiwan. And I think all of you probably appreciate this to some degree, but if you're sitting in Japan, yes, Taiwan is a separate issue, but you have to remember that Japan is closer to Taiwan than Taiwan's main island is to the mainland of China, right? So Japan has a string of islands that go down. I think most of us usually think of Japan as sort of a bunch of major islands further to the north. but all the way down the Ryukyu island chain, down to these smaller islands of Ishigaki and Yonaguni, those basically lead directly to Taiwan. And so if you're sitting in Tokyo and you're trying to figure out how you can defend your own territory, right? Yonaguni, Ishigaki, Miyako, even Okinawa, and you imagine what that would look like if Taiwan was in China's hands, it is really difficult to think about how you could stop the Chinese sort of China from pushing out, right? And potentially to pushing the US out of the region and putting Japan in a really dangerous spot where it might not actually be capable of defending those features without resorting to nuclear weapons or something else, which it doesn't have. So all of these things I think have been a real contributing factor. And I will mention one more, and I don't want to get super political here, but I think we have to acknowledge that one of the drivers that's been going on is the fear that an American president is going to leave Japan high and dry. And that's been true in Japan, it's been true in Korea, it's been true in much of Europe. And Japan, keep in mind, was probably the best US ally at managing Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump really liked Shinzo Abe. He liked Shinzo Abe enough that the Japanese openly talked about whether they needed to bring Shinzo Abe back before he was assassinated to deal with Trump if Trump got reelected, right? That's how important the US relationship is to Japan. That, you know, having a successful US-Japan alliance is so critical that the Japanese public is willing to think about changing leaders to make sure that they can do this well. So Japan, as I said, managed the Trump era really well. But what became pretty clear was that there was a pretty large group of Americans who just didn't believe that the US should be putting its blood and treasure on the line for allied countries generally, right? Especially in Europe, also in Korea, and maybe some others in Asia as well. And so I think that's been the third factor that the Japanese don't often talk about in polite company, but in private, they will acknowledge that they feel that Japan now has to do more to protect itself because they can't just assume that the US will be there 5 or 10 or 15 years from now. And it's not just about Trump, it's about, you know, the debate in the United States about whether the US should fight for Ukraine, right? That's the same debate that they're worried could happen about Japan or Taiwan or other issues. So all three of those factors have basically combined to force the Japanese government to, I think, reassess whether it's done enough in the security area. And clearly the answer is no. So in December, they put out a national security strategy. Japan's been doing this for about a decade, but this national security strategy was different. The way one of the most senior scholars in Japan described this is that usually Japanese experts put together a wish list of what they would like to see in the security strategy, and the bureaucrats whittle it down, and by the end there are 1 or 2 things out of the 50 things that the experts were hoping to see that would have been new and forward-leaning. And this time the experts put down their 50 things and they got 40 of them. So this is just a fundamental change from what used to happen in Japan. And I think it all comes back to those 3 big factors, that Japan's worried seeing what happened in Ukraine, it's worried seeing what happened with China over Taiwan, and it's worried as well about the role of the United States moving forward. And so Japan has basically decided both to double down on the US-Japan alliance, but also to double down on its own autonomous capabilities. In other words, it knows that it needs to have the ability to protect itself without such great reliance on the United States. And it's not ready for that yet. Realistically, the only way it could really do that would be to acquire nuclear weapons, which I don't think is going to be a discussion certainly under this Prime Minister. For those of you who have read a little bit about Prime Minister Kishida, he hails from Hiroshima. The big thing that he's trying to do right now is convince Joe Biden that when the G7 meets in Hiroshima in May, that Biden should go not just to Hiroshima, but also to Nagasaki, right? So this is not a guy that wants to talk about building nuclear weapons, but you do hear this debate more and more in Japan, which I think is a symptom of the fact that Japan is just increasingly worried about the role of the United States and the role of China going forward. So that's the security sphere. This is a fundamental change from one of the largest countries in the world. And oh, by the way, from the country where the US has more US assets by far than anywhere else in the world. There are over 50,000 US military members, about 100,000 if you include all the dependents in Japan, right? The other major places we've got forces, they don't come close. Korea is 28,500 forces, US forces in Korea. Germany is in the tens of thousands, but nowhere close to what Japan is, right? And the whole US fighting force to deal with the China challenge is basically based in Japan or nearby. So the Navy's main fleet, 7th Fleet, that would deal with China, is based at Yokosuka, a major naval base sort of outside of Tokyo. The Marine Corps is based in Okinawa at the 3MEF in Okinawa. And the Air Force is based in a couple places, but the 5th Air Force uses command and control at a base called Yokota. So basically, if the US is going to end up fighting a conflict with China, we're going to be fighting it from Japan, we're going to be commanding it from Japan, and we'll probably be fighting it with Japan. And it's not clear that if we were in a conflict with China, that anybody else other than Taiwan would be with us. We can have a long discussion about that. As I said, I'm a big lover of Australia. I feel very confident that Australia would sail a very fancy frigate somewhere very far away from China to make us feel very confident in their role, which is not to say that Australia is not important. It's just not anywhere near as capable as Japan, and it's nowhere near as close to the challenge, right? So when push comes to shove, not only is Japan doing more, but the US needs Japan to do more. And so on the security side, some of us have argued for a while that Japan is basically the most important US ally in the world. And I think that's just becoming more and more true. It used to be that you'd get a lot of pushback, people saying, oh, well, look what the Brits are doing, look what the French are doing, and the Germans. To be honest, I think we've seen that sort of fall by the wayside, which is not to say that NATO is not important. I've worked at NATO, I believe in NATO, but at the end of the day, what we're seeing is that NATO is struggling as a group of 30 countries to deal with one challenge in Russia. And here on the other side of the world, we're talking about the US and Japan almost by ourselves having to deal with the China challenge. So it's just a fundamentally different situation. So that's the security picture, right? Japan stepping up, doing a lot more than it's ever done before, and the US needing it to do more. Well, what about economics? Here, my view is the Biden team basically has no economic strategy whatsoever. It's not a partisan comment. I think most people in Washington would probably agree with this. I am a supporter of trade, as a lot of globalists are, right? And I'm a supporter of trade for a couple of reasons, but one is because that's what folks in Asia want from the United States. So when the US comes in and says, oh, we want you to be part of this great power competition to pretty much any country in Asia other than maybe Japan and a handful of others, what those leaders will come back and say is, thanks, what we really want is more trade or more investment from the United States. That's what they're looking for. That's the coin of the realm in Asia. And unfortunately, the US has taken itself out of the game. And not only have we taken ourselves out of the game, the Chinese have gone flying past us. So the US helped negotiate. In fact, Joe Biden led the effort in part to negotiate the Trans-Pacific Partnership about a decade ago. We've basically tossed that away. Meanwhile, China has gone ahead with what it's pushed, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So we're in a world where we led a trade agreement discussion, which we got a good deal for. We pulled out of that deal, and the Chinese went forward with their own deal. But wait, it's worse. The Chinese are now trying actively to enter the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we've pulled out from. So what's stopping them from getting in? Japan. Not by itself, and it might not last forever, but Japan has said, look, there have to be certain high standards that we expect of China if it's going to enter the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And oh, by the way, the Trans-Pacific Partnership probably would have been completely dead if not for Japan resuscitating it and basically pushing it through with the other 11 members after the United States pulled out. So on the economic side, the US is, in my view, basically lost We don't have a strategy. We don't really have an engagement plan. We have something called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is basically a lot of talk about economic issues, but without trade liberalization, right? Without lowering tariffs. And at the end of the day, what all these countries want, they want lower tariffs, they want more investment, and we're not giving that to them. But Japan is trying as best it can to demonstrate that big, important democracies are still going to invest in Asia and the rest of the world in a serious way. And so it's not supplanting what the US needs to do, but it is at least keeping movement going. Japan has been so critical to this that when the US introduced the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework about a year and a half ago, Japan basically got half of the countries on board. We didn't do it. It was our initiative, but Japan went to Southeast Asia for us and said, look, this is critical. If you want to keep the US in the game, you need to be supportive of this idea. So sometimes Japan's actually, on the economic side, doing more than the US is doing to try and help us, because Japanese leaders understand just how fraught the political dynamics are in trade policy, right? They're hard on the right, don't get me wrong. You know, I remember sitting with Steve Bannon early on in the Trump administration, and him explaining why, for conservatives, multilateral trade agreements were a terrible thing, right? So it's not that this is a left-right issue. I think, you know, a lot of Republicans don't believe in trade anymore either, and Republicans used to be the party of free trade. But Democrats still have this labor union challenge, which is going to make it almost impossible for them to embrace trade. So on the military side, Japan is basically catching up to where we are. On the economic side, Japan is filling in for where we aren't, right? But it's no less critical. Okay, so let me move over to the technology issue, which I think is one that, you know, people pay a little bit of attention to. And this is an area where I think the Biden team has been really active over the last year or so, right? They have recognized that technology is a main area of competition with China, and that the US has an edge in some areas, China has an edge in others, and the only way to protect that edge is to work really closely with a handful of allies and partners in certain sectors. And what sector is the most important? Semiconductors, right? And, you know, for those of you that have delved a little bit into semiconductors, you'll know that there's a huge difference between the most advanced nodes, right? The really high-end chips. Basically, if you have a phone on you, that phone is using a high-end chip, right? Because it's much more power efficient and much faster. And so a chip from 3 years ago just can't compete with a chip from today. And those higher end nodes are basically only produced by two major companies for logic chips. TSMC in Taiwan, and Samsung, and a couple of others like SK Hynix and the like for memory chips in Korea. And oh, by the way, there are a bunch of Japanese companies as well that lead on these issues. So essentially what we have is we have 4 countries, or 4 players at least, that are critical on technology issues related to semiconductors. Japan, the United States, Korea, and Taiwan, right? And to give you a sense of just how serious their leadership is, something like 80% of the most advanced chips in the world come from Taiwan alone, from one company called TSMC. And there's some great reading and videos that you can go look up on how you actually make a really advanced microprocessor. But basically, there's a technology called extreme ultraviolet lithography, EUV technology. And what it does is it shoots a small amount of lithium, like 80,000 times a second, to etch on the circuits onto these wafers, right? So this is the world's most advanced technology. These machines are in huge demand. There are a very small number of them. They are basically made by one company called ASML in the Netherlands. So you can think about the ecosystem on lots of technology issues and the supply chains, and many of them are global, right? They might touch 15, 20, 30 countries. But on the most critical items, semiconductors, there are basically 5 countries that matter. the Netherlands, the United States, where all of the design work is done for lots of these chips, Taiwan, Korea, and Japan. And what we've seen is the US trying to build basically a coalition to prevent, I would say, China from being able to get the most advanced nodes of these microprocessors, either through stealing them or forcing companies to build them in China. And this has been pretty tough. Korea's been hesitant to go along with some of this. The Netherlands has been pretty hesitant. Japan at times has been hesitant too. But the new government has really, I think, embraced a different approach to this. So the Kishida administration, the area that they've probably been the most forward-leaning compared to their predecessors is on what's called economic security. And economic security is basically what ties in, the security externalities that you have with any economic issue. And here they've been really willing to do things that even Japanese companies don't love, like restricting the sale of microprocessors to China, or restricting what's built in China by Japanese companies, restricting investment into China in certain sectors as well. And this has been really the only country other than the United States that has these capabilities that's been willing to do this. So I could give you chapter and verse on a whole bunch of other sectors as well, but I think the semiconductor area is probably the most important one. And why is Japan doing this? Well, in part because it's seen what happens when China has a really dominant position in a key area of a supply chain. So a little over a decade ago, Japan and China had one of their two major disputes over the East China Sea, right? There's a set of islands called the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, which are disputed by China, Taiwan, and Japan. There was an incident in which a Japanese Coast Guard vessel arrested a Chinese fisherman who had plowed into that Coast Guard vessel with his boat. The Chinese, in an effort to get him back, put sanctions, they put an export quota on something called rare earth metals. So again, in your iPhone, if you've got one, or whatever you've got, there are a small number of really critical minerals and metals that are very hard to get in the world, and a lot of them come from China. It's not that they are only in the earth in China. In fact, much of the earth comes from the United States, and it is literally shipped to China. And then the key metals are etched out of it, and they're actually then sent back to the rest of the world from China. It's a really environmentally damaging procedure, so a lot of Western companies choose not to do this. But the result was that a lot of people in Japan became much more aware that supply chains could be incredibly vulnerable to this type of coercion, right? And so they started to look at different supply chains and ask the question, which of these could be vulnerable and could be used coercively against us? And the answer was a lot. Probably even more than the United States is recognizing yet. It's not just semiconductors, right? It's battery technology, right? It's on and on. And so Japan has come up with a pretty careful way of thinking about this. It's not fully aligned with the United States yet, because we're still just beginning to get our heads around this, but I think we're seeing increasing alignment between the two on this issue. So again, on technology, Japan is one of a handful of countries in the world that is both capable and aligned with the US in terms of what it's trying to do. So let me go to the fourth one now, which is what I would call sort of values issues. And this is the area that Japan, for a long time, tended to be kind of quiet about, right? And the Japanese view tended to be, look, it's perfectly fine to be a democracy. We're happy to be a democracy, but we don't need to shove this in everybody's face. This doesn't play well in Southeast Asia. We don't want to have a bad relationship with China just because we are pushing democracy or human rights issues too hard. And so the previous Japanese governments, in many cases, would downplay the role of democracy and human rights. Shinzo Abe started to change that a little bit. But what we've seen in, I'd say, the last 5 years is the Japanese government decide that essentially it thinks that there is a major competition going on in the world between democracies and autocracies, between forms of government, between different countries about trying to write the rules that are going to govern the international order. And Japan feels that it has to step up on these values issues as well. And not just sit on the sidelines and let the United States push for democracy, human rights, etc., but Japan has to do more itself. And so I think we've seen a really rapid transformation from Tokyo and its approach to these issues. And again, if you look at the last national security strategy, it is basically a wholesale change in how Japan talks about these issues. No longer is this sort of a quiet thing that isn't politely discussed. Now it's a front burner issue for many in Japan. And this is coming at a time when, frankly, a lot of other countries in the world were kind of, I think, nervous about talking about democracy and talking about human rights issues because it put at risk their relationships with China, right? There are a whole bunch of good examples of China cracking down on other countries over Hong Kong, right? Countries that were claiming that China had done really bad things in Hong Kong, repression, jailing folks who were just trying to speak out, cracking down on protesters who were upset about what was going on with the judicial system in Hong Kong. Countries, companies were targeted for doing these sorts of things, right? So a lot of folks tried to keep their heads down and say, look, let's deal with China without trying to raise these issues too high on the agenda, lest it damage the relationship. And Japan had done that for a long time too, but I think we've finally seen Japan also come around and just decide it has to stand up for a rules-based order. A lot of those rules are based in shared values that we have with Japan and a number of other leading countries. And so in that area as well, Japan's doing much more than it ever has. So in other words, we have seen, in my view, a pretty remarkable shift in, I'd say, the last 2 or 3 years from Japan, stepping up on security, stepping up on economic issues, stepping up on technology, and most recently, stepping up on these values issues. And it comes at a time, frankly, when a lot of the rest of our allies and partners, I think, are struggling to figure out what kind of relationship they want with the United States, right? Many of our friends in Europe, I think, were terrified about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but not quite so terrified that they've fully motivated to make the kinds of changes that Japan has made, right? Pay attention to the debate in Germany, for example, which a year ago looked like Germany was going to have a wholesale change in its defense policy, and now it looks like Germany's still, tinkering on the margins. Look at the debate in the United Kingdom, right? Where, the UK wants to step up and do more, but it's just hamstrung by the results of Brexit and the challenges that Britain now has just doing basic things like, trading with Europe, right? Japan is one of the few countries that's actually really gone the other direction and done not just more, but a lot more. So where I want to end things is a couple words about what I think is maybe coming next for the US and Japan and why it's so important that we keep this momentum going. Because it is certainly possible that we could see the momentum stall either in the US-Japan alliance or just in Tokyo for political reasons, right? So I think, as you probably all appreciate, a lot of these changes were envisioned by Shinzo Abe. It's not to say that he accomplished them. In many cases, the Kishida administration has done things which Abe wanted to do but couldn't get across the finish line. But Abe was willing to push the envelope and open what some would call the Overton window, right? The window of what could be discussed. And so shortly before his death, he was doing that. He was trying to sort of create space to think even further forward about what Japan should be doing. And I think now we're in a little bit of a tricky spot in Japan, which is the Japanese government has been incredibly forward-leaning, but they've also accomplished a lot of the things that were on the alliance agenda, and a lot of the things that Shinzo Abe put on the alliance agenda. So it's not clear exactly what comes next after what Japan has just done. And it's not clear how much political support there would be for some of the hard next things that we might have to do. And one of the real challenges here is that Japan is basically governed by the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, with support from a small party called Komeito. And Komeito, for those of you that have heard of it, it is basically a sort of pacifist party for the most part. So the LDP has been negotiating with its coalition partner about these changes. And it's kind of miraculous, therefore, that they've been able to make such big changes over the last decade and keep this partnership intact. But what's going on now is that the Prime Minister Kishida is increasingly weak politically. So he's made these big changes. Those changes haven't made him particularly popular. It's not to say that they've hurt him, but domestically, he's just not seen as a particularly exciting, pragmatic leader. And so he's coming under real pressure. And I think many of us have gotten very used to dealing with the party of Shinzo Abe, even after his death, and the kind of agenda that he had, which is a very forward-leaning agenda. But when I first started paying more attention to Japan, Japan was changing leaders every 11 months. And you couldn't get anything done because the leaders were spending all of their time on domestic politics and none on foreign policy. And over the last decade, we've gotten really used to Japanese leaders thinking big picture about all of these issues I just talked about. But I think there's a danger that we fall back into this mode that we were in for many years, where we have a new prime minister every year, and that prime minister focuses on their domestic political dynamics, or maybe the LDP loses power. And look, I'm an American, so I'm happy to have whatever leader the people of Japan decide to pick. But it's a lot easier for Americans when we know basically that the LDP is going to be in power. We know what they stand for. So we're not worried about, well, what would the next government come in and do? And that's something that's changing, right? The reality is that the LDP is not going to win forever. Last time they lost, it was a pretty tricky situation for the US. We had a prime minister in Hatayama who was not a huge fan of Washington. And inevitably we'll have another prime minister of that sort at some point down the line. So we've got challenges in Tokyo, which are in large part domestic, about whether Japan can keep up this energy. And then I think, to be candid, we have some challenges in the United States as well, right? And one of the challenges is, in my view, the questioning of whether the US should really invest in sort of rich countries that can defend themselves, or whether we should force those countries to step up and do more. And even though I'm saying Japan's doing a lot more, other people are going to say Japan's still not even close to the 2% defense spending threshold that NATO has, which would still be much lower than what the US does. And increasingly, a lot of what the US is spending is to make sure that we can defend Japan or Taiwan. And Japan and Taiwan are two of the richest countries in the world, so why shouldn't they be doing this themselves? I was just in Texas. I hear this a lot from folks, whether when you get outside of Washington, this is a pretty frequent refrain, and I understand it, right? People are seeing struggles for themselves and their families, and they don't understand why the US should spend $800 billion abroad, right? And look, I'm sympathetic to that view to some extent, but I think this is something that leaders in Japan are watching really closely, and they're pretty nervous about. They're worried that the US is going to shrink from this role that we've had basically since World War II and leave Japan on its own. And so I think the challenges for the alliance are basically domestic political challenges in both Tokyo and in Washington and the rest of the country here, about what direction the US and Japan want to go in, and whether we can stay on parallel tracks over the next 5, 10, 20 years. And I think it's really, I would say, frankly, it's up for grabs, right? If you'd gone back 6 or 7 years, I would have not believed you if you'd say that there was a large contingent of Americans who thought that it was sort of fine to let the Russians invade a large sovereign country, and that we shouldn't push back too hard. But clearly the dynamics in the United States are changing, just like the dynamics in Japan are changing. So in short, I think I would argue that Japan is our most important ally now. And I think it's probably our most important ally by quite a bit in the world. But I think there's definitely are some storms on the horizon that we're going to have to deal with, and it's not going to be easy. Alliance politics are really tricky, and they're particularly tricky when you've got a massive great power like China that's posing a threat to both of us, and creates a lot of wedge issues in that alliance. So why don't I leave it there and just really look forward to the discussion with everyone. Thanks.
With that, we will move to a bit of Q&A. So if anyone has a question, feel free to raise your hand. I'll give you a call and whatnot.
Yeah, so for the last part, you talked about their values and how Japan is kind of moving the idea of democracy or democratic motion to the forefront of what they're expressing to the rest of the world of what is important. What sort of actions are they actually taking that show that? Is that something that they show in meetings with other countries? Is this something that they're expressing through their citizens?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I'll give you just maybe one or two examples of things that Japan has done recently that I don't think it would have done before. So one is that when the protests in Hong Kong in 2018 became big, a lot of us expected that Japan would really try and avoid having to make any sort of statement on this, right? In the past, this has been the kind of issue that many in Tokyo would have wanted to largely avoid. And I think what we actually saw was a lot of Japanese come out and talk much more actively about the importance of having a rules-based system, not just in Hong Kong, but more broadly, right? And the Japanese government putting in some pretty forward-leaning statements and public statements that I was just not expecting. Another good example is, it doesn't get much attention, I know, but there was a coup in Myanmar, which is a country that Japan has a really significant amount of investment in. And a lot of people were wondering what Japan would do. And in fact, the Japanese government has been far more critical of the junta in Myanmar than many of us would have expected, which is not to say that they've been quite as forward-leaning as the United States. And I'm not actually suggesting that they should be, right? I think there's some space for us to have different approaches on different issues so that maybe the Japanese keep their hand in Myanmar a little bit, so that they have some leverage there in case it's needed. So it's not always critical for us to have the exact same policy, but I think they've leaned further forward than I would have expected. And the most recent one is just what's happened on Taiwan. In the past, talking about Taiwan was sort of verboten in Tokyo. You would go and you'd speak in hushed tones and people would say, oh, let's not talk about that here. Certainly not in a public setting, right? When I was last in Taiwan, I met a bunch of Diet members, so they're equivalent of members of Congress. Last time I saw some of these people, I raised Taiwan and they said, let's discuss that separately in private. This time, it was the only thing they would talk about. And they were the ones driving the discussion. And yes, there's the military challenge related to Taiwan, the technology challenge, but a lot of what they were talking about was this feeling that actually Taiwan's a democracy of 23 million people. And they think that's important. And they think it's important to stand up for democracies, right? And so that is a really big change in approach from Tokyo, and one that I think just a few years ago would have been really hard to imagine.
Thank you.
How much of an obstacle do you think Japan's demographics will be in their sort of quest to grow the military?
Huge. And I sort of gave you the optimist case for Japan, right? The pessimist case starts with demographics. And let's be clear, the demographics in much of Northeast Asia are terrible. Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and China. If you have a little free time tonight, just go Google the demographic pictures in those countries. They're horrendous, right? So admittedly, we actually do know what's going on demographically in Japan and South Korea and Taiwan. Numbers are really, really bad. Japan tried under Shinzo Abe to do two things at the same time, which didn't work. The first was to increase the economy by getting more women to participate in the labor force. Good idea. And the second was to convince women to have more babies.
Yes.
And it turns out if you try and tell women that they need to work more and also have more children, that's a pretty hard message, right? There's only so much time. And yes, Japan's female labor participation rate has been far too low, but you can't solve that problem by telling women that they also have to have, more kids. And so what we've seen is basically, I think the Japanese government is a little bit stuck on this issue. Yes, they would like to fix the demographic crisis, but they don't really know how. They've tried some incentives, but those aren't making huge changes. It's going to lead to some pretty tough debates for Japanese. So, if any of you have spent time in Japan, you'll know, there are 100,000 US service members and their families. But if you walk around in Japan, Tokyo is a cosmopolitan city, but it's not a nation of immigrants. Japan's been pretty hostile to immigration in general. And I think one of the things that demographics is going to do is it's just going to require Japan to have a fundamentally different approach to immigration than what it has today, right? And look, Americans have a challenging relationship with immigration as well, but in Japan, it's even worse than it is here. I think here the challenge is, who's going to do a whole series of jobs that, frankly, American citizens in many cases, we know from the data, tend not to do, right? A lot of that's done by immigrant labor. Well, same is true in Japan of things like elder care, where, for example, a huge portion of the nursing population globally is Filipino. And this is actually a perfect fit, right, for Japan, right? That Philippines has a huge population of very capable nurses, and those nurses are desperately needed in Japan, right? So there's a simple solution here, right? Filipinos want great high-paying jobs in a friendly country. Japanese need lots of elder care. I think they're going to be forced into some of those debates, but it's going to create some tensions in Japanese society. The other dynamic that's happening is, so if you think big picture about demographics, there's sort of two big changes happening. One is that a lot of the countries that are the advanced democracies tend to have lower birth rates, other than the United States, right? The United States is one of the only advanced democracies that actually has a stable birth rate. Most democracies are shrinking, and some of them fast, right? So if you look at the births per woman, which is the way that you sort of calculate this, it's well under 2 in most democracies that are advanced. And in some other economies, it's even worse, right? So in China, it's terrible. So what we're going to see in Northeast Asia is the economies shrinking, in part because the demographic figures are shrinking, while other economies grow pretty rapidly because the populations are still rising. So a place like Indonesia, or a place like India, which are still seeing population growth, are going to be far more important in 30 years than I think most of us would expect. Why? Both because they're growing, but also because a lot of these other leading economies are shrinking, right? Japan is certainly one of them, so is South Korea, but just the final thought is, the demographic numbers in China are horrendous, right? So the one thing we know about young people is that young people are more likely to revolt. So if you are an autocrat, you probably would not like to have a giant youth bulge and a bunch of unemployed men in particular. Well, what did China do? It had a one China policy, which dealt with the challenge of a youth bulge, which meant that basically each woman was having at most one child, with very few exceptions. And that, unfortunately, led a lot of Chinese individuals to select to have that one child be male. So there are like 100 million more men than women in China, which is pretty crazy. And the Chinese government decided, I think, that it could basically turn this up and down when it needed to. And so after having the one China policy and realizing, this demographic problem is going to get too bad, we need to have more babies, the Chinese Communist Party tried to incentivize people to do that. And it turns out that if people have been told for several decades that they should only have one child, they don't miraculously want to have 2 or 3 children. And so the demographic numbers in China, I think, are probably far worse than they are in the advanced industrial democracies. Now, we don't know how bad they are because the Chinese just make them numbers up, which is what the Chinese do for everything. Like Chinese economic numbers, totally made up. Chinese demographic numbers, also totally made up. But, you know, those numbers are really bad. And so I think what we're going to see is basically all of these economies in Northeast Asia struggling from really bad demographic pictures, while Southeast Asia and other parts of the world rise a lot faster. And that's something that's going to happen with Japan just like it will with its neighbors.
All right. We have time for one last question.
This is more of a question about China, so
Yeah.
it's kind of a little bit on topic. But China's facing multiple crises. It has water, arable land that basically most of its land is unusable for agricultural purposes, decaying political institutions. Do you think that we're at a pivotal moment where Beijing will become more aggressive as time goes on, as it seeks to establish global prestige to alleviate some of these other crises at home?
I don't know. Which is the worst answer for a think tank expert, because you're always supposed to have an answer on everything. I think I can imagine 2 very different paths, and they require the US to take 2 totally different approaches to China. And we can't, in my view, just pick one and hope that it's right. So, you know, one path is the one that some of my colleagues at the American Enterprise Institute have written about, where China's tremendous problems catch up with it and do so, let's say, between now and 2035 or 2040, right? Demographic problems that I just talked about, environmental problems that Josh mentioned, you know, on down the line. The biggest one, of course, being that every 10 years we used to have a change in power in China, in which if things weren't going great, you would get a new leader. They would probably come in trying to fix the problems of the previous leader, and it wasn't a perfect system, but it kind of worked. Now, every 10 years, we have Xi Jinping being anointed as the next leader until he decides he doesn't want to do that. And that, I think, has led to China being in a really tricky spot politically over the next 15 years or so. Xi Jinping is unchallenged at the moment, right? He basically replaced everybody that wasn't a pure Xi supporter in the party congress in the fall, including people that many of us thought were basically off limits. He just got rid of them. He put in his buddies. The problem now is that Xi Jinping has made himself so directly tied to what the Communist Party is, and he's done this intentionally so that he can't be thrown out of office, right? So the constitution in China now includes Xi Jinping thought as one of its core tenets, right? And the reason is that makes it harder for you to separate the Communist Party from Xi Jinping, so that it's harder to say, let's move on from Xi without him making that decision. So in the short term, the system, I think, has become, harder to destabilize, let's say. But in the long term, it's become so much more brittle. And Xi Jinping is not going to live forever. And so at some point, there's going to be leadership transition in China. And I would say that is going to be an incredibly difficult period, right? Even if Xi Jinping tries to anoint his preferred leader, like Mao did, if you remember the history when Mao did this, it didn't go particularly well. And there's no reason that I think it would go much better under Xi. So the challenges in China are serious, and that's not even talking about the broader economic challenges. And I think it's pretty clear now that the Chinese government has no idea how to fix its economy. A few years ago, people have said, oh, they've got all these great economic experts. They've kind of done away with a lot of those folks, and they've brought in people that don't seem to have solutions to the problems that the Chinese economy faces right now. So their political problems, their economic problems, their environmental problems, their demographic problems. And there aren't a lot of answers. So some people say, look, China's just heading down this path towards failure. Let's just wait a decade and they'll fail, and we won't have to worry about really having to confront China in a serious way, and then it'll sort of all fall apart. I hope that's right. That would be the easier way, but I wouldn't want to bet the farm on it. And look, I'm a defense planner by background, so as a defense planner, you deal with low probability, highly serious events, and I think it's a medium probability that Xi Jinping and other Chinese leaders find their way through this difficult period. And it's not like you can't have a failing autocracy that keeps going for a while, right? I mean, just look over the border, right, at Kim Jong-un. North Korea has been a failing state for 70 years, still going, right? So I think, Josh, as you said at the end, one option would be for the Communist Party to rely more on nationalism. The other option, I think, would be for the Communist Party to have to look more inward and be focused even less internationally. And the short answer is we just don't know, right? A lot of this probably has to do with the specific way that Xi Jinping or whoever follows him decides to interpret what's happened in China. I think I can imagine a world where China is incredibly nationalistic because it's having these huge problems. And I can imagine a world where China just turns inward and says, look, let's forget about the rest of the world and just focus on ourselves for a while, right? It's not a crazy idea given that if you go back in Chinese history, that's happened fairly frequently. And so I think we have to be basically prepared for both of these eventualities, which is the really tricky challenge.
All right, let's have one last round of applause for Dr. Thank you all for coming out. Feel free to grab yourself some hot chocolate, spiced chai, or cookies on your way out. And thank you all for stopping by.